Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the massive, incredibly dense, and let's be honest, heavily charged biography of one of the 21st century's most consequential figures, Vladimir Putin. Our goal today isn't to take sides. We're just here to impartially unpack the timeline, the policies, and the absolute global shockwaves of his decades in power, looking strictly at the historical data. I want to kick things off with this specific quote from his 2007 Munich speech because it perfectly captures the geopolitical stakes we're dealing with. It's a stark, very public rejection of U.S. dominance, and understanding this worldview, that is absolutely crucial because it's the exact engine that's driven decades of Russian foreign and domestic policy.
Now, to make this sprawling timeline a bit more digestible, we're going to break this whole thing down into 5 chapters: the rise to power, consolidating domestic control, redrawing the global map, image, wealth, and persona, and finally, assessing a complex legacy.
All right, let's jump right into Chapter 1, the rise to power.
So, he was born into a working-class family in Leningrad. And a fascinating little detail here. His grandfather actually cooked for Lenin and Stalin. But Putin's own political rise was honestly incredibly fast. After spending 16 years as a KGB intelligence officer over in East Germany, he made a sharp pivot to politics. By 1998, he was running the FSB. Just 1 year later, Boris Yeltsin actually handpicked him as acting president. And Yeltsin did this to capitalize on Putin's strict law and order reputation during a time when Russia was facing immense, crippling national instability.
As he was gearing up to officially take the presidency in 2000, he made a pretty striking statement. He very publicly distanced himself from the exact communist system he had served for over a decade and a half as a KGB officer. This was a massive signal. It was his way of telling the Russian public and the world that a totally new era for the state was officially kicking off. Which brings us to Chapter 2, Consolidating Domestic Control.
Once he was actually in power, his absolute #1 priority was building a strict vertical power structure. You can see a massive contrast between the 1990s under Yeltsin, which was defined by powerful, independent oligarchs and just sheer economic chaos, and the ensuing Putin era. His administration brought in this system that economists call manual management. Essentially, the government actively curbed independent business leaders through exile or imprisonment, while simultaneously rewarding state loyalists. The goal? Centralize power and guarantee financial stability, literally at any cost.
Now, ideologically speaking, proponents inside the Kremlin call this administration a sovereign democracy. They argue this system naturally aligns with Russian traditions and rightfully rejects any foreign interference. But, on the flip side, we have to note that independent observers, human rights groups, and democratic watchdogs look at those exact same policies and consistently categorize them as anti-democratic, pointing directly to the suppression of political opponents and independent media.
So you might be wondering, how did this highly centralized system stay so popular early on? Well, it pretty much boils down to this number, 7%. During his early presidency, the Russian economy was growing by an average of 7% every single year. That is huge, and it was largely fueled by a massive global boom in oil and gas prices. This sudden flood of wealth allowed Russia to finally pay off old Soviet debts and significantly raise living standards for everyday people. And that, in turn, bought the administration an immense amount of political capital.
Moving right along to Chapter 3, Redrawing the Global Map.
With the economy finally stabilized at home, the Kremlin started pushing outward to establish a multipolar world. And this wasn't just some regional strategy either. It was a global checklist. They deepened a special relationship with China, militarily intervened in Syria to back Bashar al-Assad, sent private military contractors into Africa, and even expanded arms sales and naval exercises over in Latin America. It was a highly calculated move to aggressively counter Western influence across multiple continents all at the same time.
But closer to home, the strategy has been way more kinetic. The Kremlin has consistently claimed a sphere of influence over post-Soviet states, what they refer to as the near abroad. And this mindset led to a steady, undeniable escalation of direct military interventions. We're talking about the 2008 war in Georgia, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and of course the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
The deep ideological groundwork for that 2022 invasion is actually rooted in this specific 2021 statement. It really highlights his very publicly stated belief that Russians and Ukrainians are, historically speaking, one people.
And in his view, a Western-aligned Ukraine isn't just a political issue, it poses a literal existential security threat to the Russian state itself.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit for Chapter 4, Image, Wealth, and Persona.
When we look at the domestic polling data, there's a massive jump, from 71% up to 83% right after the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. It's a textbook example of the rally around the leader effect. But, and this is a big but, experts strongly caution us here. Sweeping war censorship laws essentially criminalize criticism of the military, making it incredibly difficult to capture truly accurate, uncoerced data. To help maintain that domestic support, the state relies heavily on some very strategic PR. They've crafted this tough, viral, father-of-the-nation superhero image. I mean, he's constantly shown doing extreme outdoor sports, he holds an 8th Dan black belt in judo, and he maintains a super tight alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church to champion conservative social values. This persona is so universally dominant over there that his name and image have literally been used to brand consumer goods. We're talking vodka, caviar, you name it.
Conversely, when we start looking at his personal wealth, political opponents paint a wildly different picture. Critics and independent investigators allege this vast, completely hidden personal fortune. The standout number here is $1.35 billion. That's the alleged cost of a massive Italianate-style palace on the Black Sea, which critics claim was funded through fraudulent means. Add in huge international leaks like the Panama Papers, and opponents argue that this immense hidden wealth completely contradicts his official, relatively modest salary as a public servant.
And that brings us to our final section, Chapter 5, Assessing a Complex Legacy.
As you can imagine, historical assessments of his decades in power are profoundly polarized. On one hand, Western experts, international human rights groups, and domestic dissidents unequivocally classify his rule as a dictatorship. They point to severe democratic backsliding, silenced media, and blatant military aggression. On the other hand, domestic supporters, and even some former leaders who openly acknowledge the system's flaws, credit him with saving Russia from total state collapse after the Soviet era. To them, he stops the chaos of the 90s and restored Russia to the status of a feared, highly relevant global superpower.
Ultimately, when we look back at this vast arc of power, this explainer leaves us grappling with one critical, inescapable question. If an entire global superpower's political, economic, and military apparatus is built around and totally centralized on the manual management of a single leader, well, what happens to the stability of Russia and the balance of the whole global order when he's no longer there? It's a profound question of long-term fragility versus durability, and it's one the world is, inevitably, going to have to answer. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating data today. See you next time.